And then at the end we will have my comments and also questions and comments from other participants and also presenters, of course. So let us start with Stavros Mavroudeas and Turan Subasat. I don't know who will be the presenter, or both of you can be presenting at different times, of course. Please start.
Stavros, can I suggest that you spend as much time as you need, really, 15 minutes if you want, no problem.
Okay, we have decided before for 25 minutes its presentation, so I'll use half of it, and then you will continue with the rest of the paper, okay? Fine?
Yes, okay.
Okay, so I'll begin by sharing, as it is usual, a PowerPoint, and then I'll remove it, and Turan will continue. The subject of our talk is the financialization hypothesis, and what we are trying to do is a theoretical and empirical critique. Okay, the financialization hypothesis, the leitmotif financialization is known to all of us, I presume. It is a popular leitmotif since the 1990s. The crux of this argument is that the financial system conquered the commanding heights of the capitalist economy, and not only that, but also gained independence from productive capital and began to dominate it. This is, I think, the differentia specifica of the financialization hypothesis argument compared, for example, with previous similar positions like this of Hilferding. Hilferding accepted that the financial system conquered the commanding heights of the capitalist economy, but never accepted that it became independent from productive capital. That is, that interest is not a subdivision of surplus value. The financialization hypothesis, at least the more coherent versions of it, argue that the financial system, however it is being defined, is independent now from productive capital. That is, it has revenues independent from the extraction of surplus value. And this we think is a critical and a very problematic analytical position with its empirical repercussions. This argument is based on several empirical claims regarding the size and the strategic role of financial entities. Our paper attempts to debunk both the analytical and the empirical claims of the financialization hypothesis by showing that in analytical terms it overrates the importance of novel financial instruments, misunderstands their function, fails to situate correctly the role of finance in a capitalist system, and in analytical terms that are crucial and critical empirical claims of the financialization hypothesis do not stand up to scrutiny. Hence, in our opinion, financialization is not an undisputed fact, but rather a problematic hypothesis. Now, to begin with, when studying the financialization hypothesis, one is struck by two initial problems. The first is situating the financialization hypothesis, and second is the problem of the very definition of financialization. What is the first problem? There is a popular belief that financialization is the exclusive property of heterodox economics. Now, in a previous paper, I with Papadatos have shown that this is not true. There are three main financialization traditions, one very robust in mainstream economics, a second one in post-Keynesianism, and third, there are Marxist and Marxism views. Each one has its own specificities but also common elements with the others. The second problem is the problem of the definition. This is a crucial problem. A theory must be specific and coherent, and the definition of the main concept should be robust and coherent. This is not the case with financialization, and many adherents of financialization accept this openly. What has happened? Once the financialization hypothesis emerged, soon it was identified as a novel stage of capitalism, a new form of capitalism, or even a new capitalism, different from the old one. However, once financialization acquired popularity and became a leitmotif used by many, then several authors maintained that it was not a novel phenomenon, but it was a recurrent phenomenon. That is a phenomenon that it has appeared in the past. Now this differentiates the picture. Let me be more specific on these issues. When the financialization hypothesis initially emerged, it was closely linked to four, supposed or not, novel empirical facts, novel characteristics of capitalism that were supposed to appear since the 1990s, not existing before. Four are these characteristics. First, that the financial systems increased share in GDP. Second, the emergence of new financial instruments, particularly shadow banking and derivatives, which led to increased speculation and volatility. Third, the financialization of the non-financial corporations, and this means the predominance of shareholders' value maximization policies and the rise of the absentee investor. This is in contrast with the supposedly previous position, that is the stakeholders' interests maximization policy. Shareholders are more fleeting, have more fleeting aims as opposed to stakeholders, that is basic owners of the capitalist firms. And the fourth characteristic is the increased indebtedness of households. Then during this initial version and this initial definition of financialization as a novel period, there was a subsequent division between those that argued that it is a transient policy. It is a policy. It came, but it can go. This was argued in the beginning by Greta Krippner, the initiator of the term. Krippner later on changed her opinion on this, but in the beginning it argued that it is a transient policy. And then those that argued that financialization constitutes a new stage in capitalism. Now, as I said before, once financialization acquired popularity, it was maintained by many authors that it's a recurrent phenomenon and that has also happened in the past. What was the argument behind this? The argument was based on Arrighi's thesis. Arrighi has argued that each distinct epoch of capitalism's world system is characterized by a hegemonic power. When this hegemon is failing, his power is failing and its epoch is ending, then the hegemon resorts to financial activities rather than productive activities. So it's the downturn in each capitalist epoch is characterized by financialization. This new perspective required a broader definition of financialization. However, this broader definition became too fuzzy. The end result is that financialization by almost the majority of its adherents is used as a buzzword denoting the expansion of financial activities without paying attention to any special features. Of course, this means definitional fuzziness, and definitional fuzziness implies directly explanatory inability. Now, the first opinion, the first view that financialization is a new stage is the most concrete one and the more robust in analytical terms. It is coherent, it correlates closely to the four above mentioned stylized facts, and it makes sense in the sense that it counterposes the new situation, that is a financial system broken loose from the yoke of the productive sector and imposed upon the latter, a situation that did not exist before. And of course this goes hand in hand with the argument of many of its proponents that the financial system has acquired sources of revenue independent from the extraction of surplus value under the auspices of productive capital. The financialization definition as a recurrent event is rather fuzzy and indeterminate in the sense that it can cover many quite different epochs and policies, and it has not analytical and empirical coherence. So we'll stick and confront the first definition. Now, as I have already said in a previous paper with Papadatos, we have identified three financial hypothesis currents: mainstream economics, post-Keynesianism, and Marxist views. Mainstream economics, they argue that from the beginning of the 21st century there is a return of financial capital. This is not bank-based but stock exchange-based. The theoretical basis is mainly new Keynesian, but with heavy doses of neoclassicism. They abandon the neoclassical inhibition about finance. For example, in a seminal paper, Levine argued that finance is a source of growth. They adopt a credit theory of money and they propose the concept of the financial accelerator. And of course they argue that shareholders' value is a democratization of the firm. Now, the mainstream financialization hypothesis has well-known problems. It lacks a robust stages theory. Its credit money theory is extremely problematic, and also when it doesn't have a social perspective, and this limits its explanatory power. The post-Keynesian financial hypothesis is probably the majoritarian one, the dominant one. They too have a credit theory of money, similar with the mainstream one. They extend, however, the credit money creation to financial intermediaries in general, not only banks. They argued that neoliberalism facilitated financialization, and then they consider this as a drag on capitalist accumulation. They have a very specific class analysis. They divide the bourgeoisie into two separate classes. This is very consistent with Keynes. The one class is the financiers, the new rentiers, and the other are the industrialists. So they actually speak about two bourgeoisies, two bourgeois classes. They argue that this financialized capitalism is inherently unstable, and in this they follow to a great extent Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, and then they suggest that a return to financial regulation is necessary. The post-Keynesian financialization theory has obvious problems. Again, one problem is its endogenous credit money theory. It cannot define coherently what is capital. Subsequently, it misconstrues the relation between interest and profit. And of course, its theory of classes is very problematic. Now, in Marxism, we discern two versions, one Marxist and one Marxisant. The difference is that the Marxist versions stick with the Marxian principle that the interest is a subdivision of surplus value, whereas the Marxisant versions reject that. A consequence of this is that when you reject this, then in the end the labor theory of value is implicitly or explicitly discarded. The first two versions that I'll present, Lapavitsas and Dick Bryan, are considered as Marxist versions, whereas the two second, the Monthly Review and Ben Fine's analysis, are considered as Marxist versions. Now, Lapavitsas adopts financialization directly from post-Keynesianism. He argues that shadow banking makes traditional banking redundant, and the financial system becomes stock exchange based. He makes a trick regarding the Marxian relation between interest-bearing capital, money-dealing capital, and loan money capital. Marx argues that loan money capital is the generic category, which is furthermore subsequently differentiated into interest-bearing capital and money-dealing capital. Interest-bearing capital and fictitious capital as a part of it are related to production, are related to the extraction of surplus value. Money-dealing capital is simply the fight between productive and non-productive capitalists for the share of the interest. Lapavitsas turn on its head this division. He argues that the generic categories are interest-bearing capital and money-dealing capital, but nowadays both are being fused into loan money capital. So loan money capital is the basic category for him, and there is no difference if financial activities are related to surplus value extraction or not. Thus, he discards the Marxian notion of fictitious capital as useless, a widow's cruse, and subsequently he essentially discards the labor theory value and its monetary theory. To avoid the criticisms that he proposes two separate capitalist classes, he argues that finance, the new master of the system, subsumes and reshapes productive capital. So there is no meaningful distinction between productive and money capital, and also merchant capital. But here there is a contradiction, because productive capital is based on surplus value extraction, whereas finance uses also usury, the pre-capitalist form of usury, and thus has another form of income. So, whereas he assimilates them, then he differentiates them in terms of what they do. So he proposes that that finance has another source of financial profit, financial expropriation, based on usury. Initially, he used the term financial exploitation. After criticisms from Fine, he dropped it. And this independent source of revenue is the cause for the increased profits of the financial system. There is a very interesting point here. Lapavitsas himself argues that finance exploits us all. This means that finance does not only exploit workers, but also can exploit middle strata and capitalists. So essentially, it is a different class from the rest of the bourgeoisie. 2 points, and I close with this. He suggests that this is a new stage of capitalism, and also that there is no general theory of crisis, for example, the falling rate of profit, but each crisis is historically specific. Now, Dick Bryan and Tal follow a similar path. They argue that since the early 1980s, finance has become commodified, and thus it is not labor time that determines money, but vice versa. Then they make a very bold argument that labor has become a form of capital because of the financialization of daily life, and thus exploitation is not confined to unpaid labor time, but extends to usury. Now, if labor is a form of capital, this implies directly a new class structure different from typical capitalism, and Bryan and all have accepted that and explicitly argued for it. There is another serious problem in their analysis. They consider that derivatives operate as money. This is not empirically sustainable. Some following from Bryan, for example, Christophers, extended their analysis in declaring that finance is a productive activity, a value-producing activity, and they also replaced Marx's theory of value with a vague version akin to neoclassical economics. That is, they argued that financial risk is a source of value, which is utterly problematic. Now I'll move fastly.
Stavros,
Yep.
if you are going to share the time with
Yeah, I know.
Turan,
I know. I'll be very fast now.
to understand,
Yep.
I mean, you don't have much time, 5 or 6 minutes.
Yep.
Okay.
5 minutes. Okay.
5 minutes together.
No, 5. Oh, yeah. Okay. I'll skip this.
Okay, so please try to
Okay.
accelerate.
Okay. I'll
Be
drop.
faster if you
Yeah. I'll drop all this. Sorry, I lost the time. I was supposed to be the bad guy. Now the monthly review offers a more coherent version. He argues that monopoly capitalism has evolved into a new phase, monopoly finance capitalism. In this new phase, underconsumption is hidden, as increasing income inequalities are covered by snowballing indebtedness of households. So they define finance capital in broader terms than Hilferding, but they do not accept that financial profit has become independent. I skip all this and I'll move to benefit and here. The growth of finance for fine during the last 30 years, a special phase of neoliberalism. He supports the Marxian labor theory of value and its theory of money. The basic problem in Ben Fine's analysis is that he does not relate financialization to profitability. And this remains a problem in his analysis still today. I end here. Okay, and stop sharing this for Turan to take up.
Hi, I would like to ask the chair if I have any time or how much time do I have?
You have time to integrate, to finish or complete the argument. How much time do you want? 5 minutes, 10 minutes? 10 minutes is enough?
10 minutes is enough because I'm going to skip most of it.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
You can take some of my time, Korean. I will need some.
Mine too. I mean, he can take us. So please.
Okay, I will definitely finish it in 10 minutes if I cannot.
Good. Okay, go ahead.
So this part is relatively simple compared to the theoretical issues, but the findings are quite interesting at least. I mean, when I investigated this issue, I realized that there are a lot of myths in this literature, so I'm gonna try to expose 4 of those. So I'm gonna go very quickly. The first myth is this: just a few hundred multinational corporations run the world economy, and of these, 2/3, in other words, 66.6% are financial companies, says done fine. So I used this famous Forbes database, which was really difficult actually to work. I mean, identify financial ones from the others. It took me like virtually months to get this data, but Forbes database actually has 2,000 companies, but I had to stop at 1,000. So basically, what I've done here, you can see, I looked at, first of all, the largest 10 multinational companies in the world. Then I looked at 50 companies, 100, 500, and 1,000 companies in the world, and how many of them are actually financial. So when I looked at the 10 companies, 8 companies are financial out of 10, which can kind of supports one fine argument. But when you focus on 50 and etc., you realize that it declines to 44%. I mean, this is 80% or 8 companies, declines to 44%. 39, 31, and 17%. So as you increase the number of companies, you realize that the share of financial companies decline rapidly. There is one interesting thing here. If you exclude Chinese firms, this declines from 8 to 3. In other words, if you look at the largest 8 financial companies, actually 5 of them are Chinese, and that was really surprising for me. I think that does. I mean, in the paper I made a number of other arguments based on this database, but because of time, I'm going to skip that. I think that's enough to say that Dan Fine's statement is incorrect, really. The second myth is financialization involves the growth of the financial sector, which has become too large. So we are talking about really the expansion of financial sector. The ratio of financial assets to economic activity increased threefold over the past 30 years. So if you look at the 30 years, past 30 years, it increased threefold. And then Fine asks again, why on earth, why on average should it take 3 times as much finance to produce something as previously? So I decided to check that by using the OECD database. So this figure shows you over the 30 years the expansion.
Do you show us figures? Because I don't see them.
Really?
Yes.
You don't see anything at all?
I see the myth of...
You see the title.
Okay,
So,
now we see. Now clear. Okay.
right, okay. I wish you were here earlier, so you missed the date.
I thought that this was the way to present it. But anyway, continue. If you want to go back.
Okay, let me show you one thing.
I've read the paper, so I didn't have trouble to
For
follow.
the others, look at that. I mean, like 80%, I mean, 10 companies, 50, 100, 500, and 1,000 companies. The financial companies, the share of financial companies, initially 80%, but declines substantially as you increase the number of companies. Therefore, Ben Fine's statement that 2/3 of largest multinational companies is not really supported by this evidence. But okay, let me continue with the other. Okay, here is the claim. Financial sector actually grew very, very rapidly. Okay, is that really the case? When I looked at for the last 30 years, for 42 countries, the change in the financial sector share in total GDP. So on the left-hand side, you see countries that experienced financial sector expansion, relative to the economy. And on the right-hand side, actually, you see that, the countries that experience some kind of definancialization or the decline in the financial sector. And if you look at United Kingdom here and United States, their expansion is very small actually. The increased share of financial sector is only 1.6 for the UK and 1.3 for the United States. So these are not really large numbers even for this, countries that come to mind first, right? When you think about financialization, you focus on these two countries. But if you ask which countries experience the most rapid increase, you see I highlighted some of them. South Africa is the highest one, actually, interesting. But then we have China, third place, right? And the question comes to mind, a country that is associated with industrialization. Why does it need so large, actually, financial sector and increase, actually? Then we have the Republic of Korea. That's another interesting case. Then if you look at some other countries here, European countries that were struck by the financial crisis the most, suffered the most, like Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal. Their financial sector actually shrunk during the last 30 years, as a percentage of the GDP. I think this is quite interesting. And the third, checking my time, 2 minutes, finance expands at the expense of real investment. I will share you only one figure, last one here, okay. Now, what I've done is to look at the share of different sectors, but remember the claim here, if you read the claims, I move quickly, but they say, look, financial sector expands and reduces the share of industrial sector. That is the claim. So financial sector can actually impact on industrial sector in different ways. But I'm not dealing with that, but I'm dealing with this very specific claim. So financial sector expands and the industrial sector declines. Is that the case? So, I have the data between 1995 to 2018, but I divided into 3 categories. This 1995 to 2000, 2000 to 2007, 2007 to 2018. If you look at the overall data, what we see here is this. Look, the share of manufacture indeed declined as a percentage of GDP substantially over this. This is the average of 35 countries, remember, okay? But if you look at finance actually declined slightly. And very small, but science, real estate, and information, the public, the other sectors increased quite substantially. But if we look at the subcategories, we see that in the 1995 to 2000, yes, manufacturing sector declines, finance increased tiny bit. In 2010, 2007, the financial sector increased quite substantially, but less than construction and science. And this is, of course, I consider it as the financialization period, expansion of financial sector, a bubble economy was created. In 2007-18, you realize that both finance and manufacturing sector declined together. After the expansion, financial sector actually declined. And overall, as you can see, manufacturing sector declines. But is it caused by finance? Probably not. What is it caused? The increase in the other sectors. And finally, I have 30 seconds. The financialization is caused by financial liberalization. So financial liberalization and financialization is linked together. I estimated very simple regression models. Brief conclusion is that there isn't any statistical link between these two variables. So you need to look at somewhere else to find the reasons for financialization in that very specific time period. Okay, thank you, that's all. Right on time, Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to ask something, if I may, now, very shortly. What do you measure on the vertical axis in the previous graph?
This one?
Yeah, vertical axis, what do you have?
Change in the sector share.
Change, okay. Thank you
Yeah,
very
I mean, some increase, some, shares, some of them increase, some of them decline, and on average, of course, it's zero, right? They eliminate each other.
That's a share of GDP, is it correct?
Yes.
No, change in GDP or the change in the share, not the share.
Change in the share,
Change
yes.
in the share. Yeah?
But that's the percentage of GDP, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. You were on time, appreciate it. And we'll continue with the second presenter. Bob is...
I think Turan will take his screen off.
Okay, yeah, sure. And the topic...
He's sharing.
Okay, please, let's start.
Is it done?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, shall I start, Turan? Is it okay to start?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Sorry, there is a start. Okay, well, guys, it's Michael Roberts speaking for publicity purposes. This paper just briefly wants to concentrate on whether the Great Recession, which has been the biggest slump in capitalism, at least since the 1930s, in 2008-9, was the result of what we might call financialization, has already been discussed in the previous paper by Stavros and Turan. In other words, by the instability of the financial sector, or whether, therefore, it is an exceptional change from perhaps previous slumps, or whether it is still part of the general laws of capitalist development that Marx outlined over 150 years ago, and which have been developed by other Marxists, and in particular a recession related to what is happening to the underlying profitability of the economy. So it's defined as between a Marxist explanation of the Great Recession and, if you like, a financialization explanation, which is based very illiterally on using Hyman Minsky as the alternative, the Minsky moment as opposed to the Marx moment. Now, as Stavros and Turan have already outlined, I won't spend too much time on this, that what we mean by financialization originally could be, as Einstein says, simply the increasing role of the financial sector and financial actors and institutions in international economies, which is, perhaps you might say, not a very exciting idea, to leave it as general as that, but Krippner, he went further and said that actually the pattern of accumulation which profit-making occurs increases through the financial channels rather than through trade and production, and actually it means that there's a new form of capitalism dominated, as Stavros was explaining, by the financial sector over the productive sector. And this is where the instabilities in capitalism will now arise, and followers of this view, based on heterodox post-Keynesian economics like Steve Keen, would say that capitalism is inherently flawed, being prone to coups and crises because of the financial sector. And this is the development we saw, particularly from the 1990s up to 2007, of the growth of financialization, particularly the credit bubble period of 2007, explains the Great Recession. So, as John Milios has said, it was the financial crisis and the Great Recession that led to the fall in profitability, not vice versa. So briefly, we won't go into this too long again, but Marx obviously recognise the role of the credit system and, if you like, the financial system in the process of capitalist accumulation. It's a main lever of overproduction and over-speculation, but it's also a necessary part of capitalism in order to allow the, if you like, the lubricating of the wheels of capital accumulation, so that the self-expansion of capital can go beyond just what's available at the immediate time for capitalists in terms of profits to invest, that they can draw on credit to expand production beyond the immediate fetter and barrier to production, which is the amount of profitability that they have at any one particular time, using the credit system, on the expectation that by expanding that, by borrowing, if you like, they will be in the position to increase the capital accumulation and production and deliver more value to pay for that credit. But, as Marx says, that's, if you like, one side of the coin. The other side of the contradiction is this creates the possibility of increasing the violence and depth of crises and slumps, and therefore to threaten the system as a result. So credit has two sides to the coin and not just one. Therefore, he then developed, as we know, the idea of fictitious capital to define investment in financial sectors, assets, stocks, bonds, etc., and derivatives of these. And this, while it provides flexibility in the economy, increasingly can become an impediment to the health of the economy. But the main point here is that when does it become an impediment rather than something that increases the ability of capital to be distributed, in money capital to be distributed and expanded across the capitalist system in all parts of the growing network? When does it become increasingly fragile and offer a cause or a trigger towards crisis? That the financialization people don't actually say why the financialization, the expansion of the financial sector and so on, should suddenly become an impediment rather than something that expands the economy. Irving Fisher, who presents an argument about debt, if we're looking at that from the point of view of fictitious capital, said, yes, over-indebtedness develops, but it only comes really when the opportunities to invest at profitable levels begins to disappear. And that there he had perhaps the underlying reason for when financial crises turn into slumps. And similarly, in a more modern theory, Boulder, who presents the argument that credit development is causing financial stability, instability actually says that it depends on when you have record high interest rates, maybe as in the earlier 1980s, but also low adjusted returns on productive capital. So the position between high interest rates and low profitability means that the low, if you like, profitability enterprise is the fundamental factor lying beneath that. So that is, in a way, where I'm leading the argument. And yes, we have to recognise there has been a significant expansion of financial sector profits in some economies, because Turan has now explained to us that this is not particularly a generalised result. But if we take the United States, where the Great Recession certainly kicked off, with the collapse of the property market and the assets based on that property market, we can see that the financial sector profits in that period leading up to the crisis of 2008-9, in 2007 we saw a very sharp rise in the share of financial sector profits in total US corporate profits. So that would appear to give some support to the idea of financialization, however you might want to define it. And if we look over the period of, say, the 1990s up until the Great Recession, we can see there are various periods when there appears to be what you might call credit bubbles, or Minsky moments, that so you get an expansion of credit relative to GDP. This is global credit to GDP. So you can see that it's in the left-hand column here. This is global credit to GDP. How do I find that? That's total debt, as defined by the IMF, of household, private and state debt. So we have a rise there in this period. Then we have recession. The Japanese banking crisis leads to an overall fall in the level of corporate credit. Then we have a new the big credit bubble, which Torin mentioned and seen in his figures. culminating in, so that was the period of the late 90s, and then we get a recession, a mild one in 2001, then the big credit bubble, which you might call new monetarism, or the development of all these other financial engineering derivatives and so on, which became part of this particular credit bubble, and in property particularly, leading to the collapse in 2008-9, the recession, and the shifting of much of this debt into the public sector. But one of the other myths that has been presented, and Turan has presented several, argued by the financialization people, is that finance, or profits from financial income, has now become a powerful and dominant feature amongst non-financial companies. Jakub Rabalinich of the University of Paris looked at the data for non-financial companies in the US and elsewhere, and he finds there's no evidence to say that the financial income is now a dominant feature of companies like Amazon, Netflix, or the FANGs, or even the large companies in more traditional sectors of the economy. And even if you add up the dividends gained by companies in other cross investments, and the net gain from assets and total net capital gain, etc. If you do that, the maximum you're going to get over the whole period, going back to the 50s in the case of this survey, is about 3.5 to 3% of total income is actually financial income in these companies. So the argument that Amazon, for example, is really a financialized company is nonsense, because its income comes mainly from what it does, which is to collect, distribute, and deliver products of goods and other things to households and other people on a massive scale, and that is its fundamental operation, and that's where it makes its profit. Facebook makes its profit from advertising revenues, not from the fact that it runs a bank, although it would like to do so. So this is not correct to say that there's been a merging of finance and production where non-financial companies are really just financialized. There's another factor in relation to the data that Turan has given. Durand has presented the argument that there's been a switch to financial investment, and he presents 4 reasons why that might be the case, and tries to analyse empirically to see whether which one is more important. One is that there's been increased monopolisation, and so that means more finance. One is the development of control by banking and financial sectors, the rentiers are, and there's been a switch to looking for rentier investment rather than production investment in order to get profits, the financial turn of accumulation, he says, and of course globalization has meant that many companies internationally have come under the influence of financial loans and so on. Well, my view on that is to say, well, all these factors may have some role, but we haven't really explained why, Durand does not, why these things have developed. And what is the reason for, if there is a switch to financial investment, for whatever reason, he presents 4 reasons here in a way, what is the underlying reason for this switch towards financial investment rather than productive investment? And I would argue that we can return to Marx, and we can turn to the evidence provided by modern Marxist analysis, that it's due to falling profitability in the productive sectors of the major economies. Again, looking at just the US, this is a measurement by Bassett-Wasner of the rate of profit in non-financial sector capital in the US. He has a very nice, Bassett-Wasner has a very nice little website now where you can follow this particular version that they've done on the rate of profit and bring it up to date as we go. And you can see quite clearly there's a long-term decline in the US rate of profit on non-financial capital. So the non-financial sector, which is by far the biggest sector still in the US economy, has had increasing difficulties in sustaining a high and increasing rate of profit. And except for the period neoliberal recovery, which we can see from the early 80s, after the slump in the early 80s, up until the end of the 20th century. Apart from that, and since then, we can see that there has been a decline in the rate of profit. Of course, in the COVID slump at the moment, it's the lowest level it's been, at least on this chart. So, and certainly before we got to the Great Recession in 2008-9, profitability was lower than it was in 1907, and also begun to fall before then. Peter Jones, the Australian Marxist economist, in the previous paper, tried to strip out the fictitious part of corporate profit in the whole corporate sector. In other words, gains that can be made by capital gains or by dividends, share buybacks, etc., and look just at the profit being gained from productive investment. And when he did this measure, his measure of non-fictitious corporate profit, we can see that the black line, that there is a significant decline in the profitability of non-fictitious corporate profit over this period, and that coincides very much with what's happening to the actual growth of this sector. So, if you like, capitalists in the non-financial sector, or in the corporate sector as a whole in the US, have found it more and more difficult to maintain a level of profitability by productive investment, so that has increased the view that they should be switching to areas which might at least deliver some higher profitability over a period of time. And our moderator here and Podgaris have come up with a similar paper, which their conclusion being that the Great Recession of 2007 is a classical type of recession. It's based on rising value composition of capital that more than offsets the rate of surplus value, giving rise to a falling rate of profit, and the tendential fall of the latter led to a falling mass of profits, real net profits, to use that particular definition prior to the Great Recession, and falling net investment, and therefore the basis of the collapse in the economy. So the consequences of both capital intensity and increasing switch also to unproductive activities are the reasons behind the slump of the Great Recession in 2007. Contrary to the view of the financialization exponents, they see it as a Minsky moment, just a question of financial instability. And I can show here on a little graph for the US non-financial sector, if we look at the whole period of 1945 to 2020, you can see that the position of Lefteris and Podgaris is correct, that we have a sharp increase in the organic composition of capital, the blue point, and actually over this period I find a falling rate of surplus value, a certain amount over this whole period, and that has led to a fall in the rate in the rate of profit is certainly changing. That's the change in the rate of profit over this period due to the grey block. In the golden age, it was lovely. Everything was going fine. All three blocks are in the positive territory. In the great profitability crisis of the 60s to the early 80s, we can see that there's a big drop in profitability, a fall in the rate of surplus value, and basically no change in the organic composition of capital in that. And then in the neoliberal period, we get similarly positive result for capitalism, higher rate of profit, as the rate of surplus value outstrips the rise in the organic composition of capital. But in the period of the 21st century, primarily, we see a sharp rise in the organic composition of capital, relative fall in surplus value, and that leads to a relatively large fall in the rate of profit. So Marx's law is supported, as far as I can see, by the evidence, in this is in the US non-financial sector. And if we're looking at profitability eventually leading to a fall in the mass of profits and creating the conditions for slump, then again the evidence is supportive of that idea. We can see that we begin to see a fall in the total mass of corporate profits before tax in the US non-financial sector prior to the recession of the major recession that we get in my screen is just hiding. I can move that. Yeah, so just before the Great Recession, we can see that the fall in the mass of profit begins well early. that before anything is talked about financial instability or property slump and so on, the peak is taking place in the middle of 2006 and starts to fall, and obviously it falls right in the depth of the Great Recession, but already total massive profits was falling in the US non-financial sector before we get to the financial crash and the Great Recession. So now a piece of evidence which suggests that we need to be looking at the profitability of the capital sector and not whether it's got too much debt or is engaged in too many what would appear to be problematic financial activities. And in fact, that's the case in all recessions, according to the evidence that I can provide here, that if we look at previous recessions, we find that there, before, this is 1 year before or just before the slump actually is established in various periods, and we can see in period 1955 to 58 there was a fall in the US rate of profit and a fall in the massive profit before we get to the 58 slump. Similarly, the great slump, international slump of 74-75, starting in 1973, there was actually a fall in the rate of profit and the massive profits to take that place. And in every recession, with the exception of this one here, there has to be a fall in the massive profit alongside the fall in the rate of profit before we get to that slump in the Great Recession. We can see, of course, in the case of Great Recession, a significant slump in the mass of profit. And if we look globally, this is basically the 5 largest major economies, global corporate profits, weighted by me in a rather crude manner, but you can do it more effectively, but it wouldn't make any difference to the general trends. You can see that every time there is a slump in the global profits, even going to negative territories, we have a bust, the Great Recession, the dot-com bust, the EM crisis, even briefly the Euro debt crisis, and we had a little bit of a mini recession in profitability and profits in 2016, which actually saw a sharp slowdown in the economy, and we could see just before the virus broke in 2020 that actually globally global corporate profits had entered negative territory before COVID. Guillermo Calcedi has presented evidence to show that the connection between the financial and non-financial profits in recessions, that on every occasion when we have a proper slump in production, investment, employment and incomes, it has to be accompanied by a collapse in non-financial profits. There are many financial crashes, but if there's no collapse in non-financial profits, we don't get a recession in slumps, as we have seen in production, investment and employment. So there is a combination of two. Guillermo argues that it doesn't matter which comes first, as long as they're both together. And you can see in the case of the Great Recession, the significant slump in financial profits, yes. And if it was just a question of financial instability, then you would expect this anyway. This is the Minsky moment, if you like. But it must be accompanied by a collapse in the profits of the productive sector as well, the non-financial sector. And in the case of the Great Recession, it was significant as well. So that's, if you like, the Marxist moment. These two must be together to get the result of the slump. And in every case where there's been a drop in financial profits, negative period, without the blue block going negative, there's not been a slump. So productive determines the unproductive. And contrary to the financialization thesis, as Mia Kokady has said, it follows that it's the productive sector that determines what happens in the financial sector in the end. And the basic point is that financial crises are caused by the shrinking productive base of the economy, and thus a point is reached when there's a sudden massive deflation in the financial and speculative sectors. It looks as though this is the cause of the crisis, but actually what is underlying the cause of the crisis is what is happening to the profitability in the productive sector. And that's me.
Okay, you were on time. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. And we will continue now with the next speaker. And the next speaker is Ricardo Eduardo Gomez. And please tell us the topic and start.
Okay, thank you. It's really morning here, so I will probably not be at my most eloquent. Apologies in advance, but I will do my best. So the topic of my talk is the store value and means of circulation, old contradictions, new expressions. This is of course related to the discussion on financialization in ways that I shall explore shortly, but the general idea is that the issue of money, Stavros already pointed out to this, the issue of what money constitutes and what the expansion of the financial sector in what way it relates to money has been either misrepresented or sometimes avoided or sometimes taken on in a rather simplistic fashion by financialization literature. So I will give a brief motivation. This has already been taken on by previous speakers, but financialization is usually described as growing in importance by Epstein, for example, which is ambiguous. Michael pointed this out, not very exciting. Some people like Pali, I like Pali very much because he's very explicit and metaphorical about his ideological take on the matter. He talks, for example, about transfer of income from the real sector to the financial sector and increasing income inequality due to wage stagnation provoked by financial mechanisms and the combination of the financial over the real sectors. So this notion of income transfers has two expressions which are complementary but also somewhat contradictory in some instances. One idea is that of financial rentierism. This idea was refuted by Rabinovich in the article that Michael already quoted and showed as a graph. And Rabinovich refutes the idea that non-financial corporates are getting a large part of their profits from financial dealings, which is a very recurrent theme in people like Greta Krippner or Epstein. But the other, which is not necessarily refuted by Rabinovich, is that of financial displacement. In other words, that non-financial corporates find it more attractive to direct their investments towards financial dealings as opposed to productive investment. So it's not so much that they're actually they're having to spend a lot of their income on managing portfolio hedging and things of the sort as opposed to investing productively. So this increases their costs, their financial costs, and inhibits them from investing. So this hypothesis was refuted by Kleeman and Williams in 2013. I didn't get permission to reproduce their graphs here, but you can have a look at it. It's graph 14, it's very illustrative. And essentially the point is that investment as a share of profits has not gone down during the period of financialization. I have produced a few graphs of my own to illustrate this point. I will just show them briefly to you. So this is from US data, and actually it's from G20 data. This is a pondered average of the countries of the G20 in 2018, plus a few invited guest members. And what we can see here is that investment as a share of surplus value, calculated following the methodology that was suggested by Michael Roberts, has not gone down actually during the period of financialization. It has in fact gone slightly upwards. What has gone down is the rate of profit, which is the blue line here. So the explanation for lower investment rates is not that companies are not investing their profit, but rather there's a lower amount of profits relative to capital.
Please, the graphs, I mean, we drive crazy. I mean, please let us see.
Really quick.
Oh, okay. I was concerned that I wouldn't have enough time to apologize.
I'm busy after.
Yes. So the right axis is the rate of profit, and it's showing the blue line. And the left axis is investment as a share of surplus value. And this data is taken from the 10 world tables. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, this is just for illustrative purposes. This is a similar exercise, but US data, and essentially what it's showing is that investment is a fairly direct linear relationship to the massive profits. So it's not the case that there is retained profits by corporations on aggregate scale.
These are constant prices.
These are from the national incomes production accounts, so they are. I'm not sure. Let me check for you.
Current. They are current.
Okay. I'll keep the question in mind. I think they are. I'll check. This is from my master's dissertation. I haven't seen the methodology in a while now, but I'm fairly sure they are. Okay, so let me just go back. So I want to propose a different definition, a starting definition of financialization, which is a sustained and structural quantitative separation between the accumulation of real and fictitious capital. So this doesn't presuppose a causal relationship that goes from the financial to real accumulation, rather it simply observes that there has been a changing dynamic where the rate of accumulation in financial assets is not directly related to the rate of accumulation in real existing capital, infrastructure, and variable capital, and so on, which is pretty much an undisputed fact. So now, I want to talk about money and how there is a dialectic contradiction in capitalism between two roles of money. Money as a store of value and money as a means of circulation. And the reason why this is important is that I will sustain that financialization is a new expression of this old contradiction of money in capitalism, and it is taking this contradiction to new expressions through fictitious capital. So let me just begin at the beginning. So I need to hide this because I cannot see my own screen. There. So the credit relationship, which is of course of a pre-capitalist origin, but is only expanded on a general scale in capitalism, presupposes money as a means of payment, and money as a means of payment presupposes some relationship to value, and value of course depends on commodity as an accepted form of exchange that implies commensurability between different producers. So already here we're talking about measured value, and measured value presupposes some form of commensurable abstract social labor. So here we're already implying the general equivalent form. So I very much appreciate the work of Susanne Brunov, who has developed how in Marx there is a contradiction, which is dialectical, between store of value and means of circulation, and she draws it very carefully from first definitions. And the means of circulation function already presupposes that money can represent value, therefore function as a temporary means of deposit of value, store of value, but also the store of value presupposes that the store of value can be expressed objectively, and it can only be expressed objectively through exchange, not through any abstract formulation or any accounting measurement of abstract value. This abstract value can only be expressed in an objective form through commodity exchange. So therefore, we have an interdependence from the beginning between these two roles of money. But this interdependence, which is contradictory because one it becomes contradictory in capitalism because expanded accumulation of capital demands a continuous expansion of means of circulation. On the other hand, even simple reproduction of capital demands that this means of circulation maintain a stable measure of value. Now, why do these two become contradictory? Because in the credit relationship, refunctionalized for capital accumulation, the payment commitments and the debt structure that is generated depends on the expectation of future production of value, which is of course in capitalism dependent on the generation of surplus value. So following Martha Campbell here, the original simple commodity circulation means you have money, you acquire a commodity with this money and then you change it for So you have commodity, you change it for money, and then you have another commodity. It's simple circulation of commodities. Now, here in this relationship, when it becomes generalized, it acquires the appearance that it is money that generates commodity circulation and not the other way around. In other words, it is money circulating that provokes commodities to be circulated. So if you have more money, then more money will demand circulation, and therefore if there aren't more commodities to circulate, then money might be devalued. And this is the ideological basis, if you like, for the quantitative theory of money. Now this appearance becomes concrete, says Martha Campbell, with the relationship of capital, because in capital it is indeed money circulating that provokes commodity circulation, but that is only because the specific purpose of capital is to valorize itself, to expand itself through circulation. Of course, this expansion only happens through the mediation of commodity circulation and production. But she says, by the time this happens, the laws that govern money circulation are different, because specifically capitalist money is credit. It is not gold or other, or even symbolic money. Not paper money with relationship to gold or to any other money commodity. It is credit relationships that are sustained through an institutional structure that is ultimately backed by the state or some other guarantor. So the laws of this circulation are different because it depends on payment commitments, the interrelationship, the maturity structure of these commitments, and also the concentration of means of payment at different points of the circulation of global capital. So the laws governing this flow are different. It doesn't depend on the accumulation of gold or some other general equivalent. So general equivalent is always a reference point that has to provide money circulation with a reference called value, real existing abstract social labor, but it doesn't have to exist physically in order for it to play this role. And herein develops the dialectical contradiction between the roles of money. Now this is a very graphical, simple representation of what I'm trying to explain by this. The function of money as means of circulation, the demand of it as flexible expansion of value signs, and adapting to the demands of circulating capital through credit mechanisms. And this leads, of course, to the creation of fictitious capital, because and this is a very interesting point, in Volume 3 of Capital, I think it is Section 4, somewhere around Chapter 19, Marx explains the difference, Stavros was already mentioning this, the difference between money-dealing capital and interest-bearing capital. So Marx explains money-dealing capital as something that rarely, if ever, happened in capitalism in a pure form. And he explains the profit that money-dealing capital acquires in a very similar fashion to that of commercial capital. If you remember, commercial capital acquires profit not through the creation of surplus value, but through the appropriation of surplus value, because it makes commodity circulation more efficient and thereby appropriates a share of the pie, as it were. So initially, money-dealing capital works in a very similar way, except that rather than dealing with commodities, they deal with money, with the general equivalent. So as Marx mentions as an example, some accounting families and firms in the Netherlands in the 17th century, something that was a transient phenomenon, that eventually led to interest-bearing capital. Now, interest-bearing capital has the capacity to create value signs ex nihilo, without any prior existing real general equivalent form of value. So this is what the post-Keynesians might call endogenous money, right? So banking institutions create value signs for the purposes of the circulation of capital, and they endorse those value signs with their institutional prestige, which in turn depends upon other institutions that ultimately lead to the state, and when history develops further, to central banking. So this form of structure, which enables the creation of fictitious capital for the purpose of circulation of capital, eventually depends on the creation of surplus value to validate this entire mechanism. Of course, this is not always the mass of surplus value that is compromised in this mass of value signs is not always actually created and produced. So this creates conflict between the role of money as means of payment and measure of value. And herein lies the contradiction or what Susanna Bruno would call the dialectical contradiction between the role of money as means of payment and means of circulation. And it is a contradiction in an internal unity that is only resolved temporarily and in a transient manner through monetary and financial crises. Now, these crises are, of course, the expression of underlying crises of profitability, because it is only when profitability is systematically not produced on a large enough scale to validate debt structures that the crisis breaks out and that the inner contradiction of these two functions is temporarily resolved. So there's the quote I like: the credit system is the offspring of capitalist production and monetary circulation. I think this more or less suggests what I've been explaining so far. So very briefly, I just want to stress the point that what I mean, I want to explain rather what I mean by fictitious capital. I think we all know what it means, but just to be on the same page, of course, capital is value that accrues value through circulation, and this is mediated by the production of surplus value. Fictitious capital, on the other hand, attributes an imaginary or an imputed value to a present-day contract that depends on the expected future flow of revenues, which sometimes, rather than revenues, they can be other value signs which may be themselves fictitious capital. So we have fictitious capital, that is the expectation of future fictitious capital that imputes an imagined present value to present-day contracts, or otherwise what we call commodified assets, financial assets. I'm going to get to this in a minute. So before I get to that, I want to talk about how this relates to financialization. Financialization is indeed a hypertrophy of finance, in the sense that it is, we have seen an expansion of the financial sector that is not correlated and may or may not be functional in some ways to the real accumulation of capital. That is something that has to be investigated by the way, not presupposed, as in many of the post-Keynesian literature. What this implies, amongst other things, is that we have seen hoarding of value, of real existing value, in financial assets. So, for example, pension funds or otherwise institutional investors will buy financial assets as a form of value storage. And this implies a hoarding that happens through the acquisition of complex portfolios and financial assets that are deposits of value, however temporary they may be, because eventually these institutions will try to resell or otherwise keep circulating these assets in order to provide yield or otherwise a stable or relatively stable measure of value for their clients, whom amongst others are households in countries in the first world, for instance, who have to who are forced rather to acquire for their future provision of household and consumption through these type of mechanisms. So this leads, amongst other things, to a growing debt structure that is integrated and possibly fragile, and also cycles of asset inflation and inflation that he has described. So a question that is pertinent to all of this is, how does this modify the distribution of circular value amongst the many capitals? So I think we all agree in this panel at any rate that there's an underlying problem of profitability, which has to do with rising productivity in a specifically capitalist form, which expresses itself in a rising organic composition of capital. And this is the underlying problem which prompts and provokes different forms of financial crises. Now, of course, financial crisis displays displaces the crisis in time and space, and implies that some people and some institutions and some countries are hit harder than others, or have perhaps more access to credit or to mechanisms by which they can push the crisis onto somebody else. And this implies surplus value.
Ricardo, sorry for interrupting. 2 or 3 minutes. Please wrap it up.
Okay. So, of course, this raises the question. Let me get to the questions. I want to raise a few questions and then exercise another characterization of financialization to finish. The question is, how does the expansion of the financial sector redistribute surplus value? I already said this, but also there is a related matter at this, and is I rather like Stavros mentioned that Brian and Rafferty's work in passing, and I think he mentioned an important point, which is that somewhere in the discussion with Tony Norku, for example, they talk about how the commodification of financial products involves actual work in the development of these products and so on and so forth, and therefore they can be considered a commodity. And this is imprecise in some accounts because, of course, their value does not depend on the actual work that is gone into producing them. It is unrelated. However, they do work as deposits of value, and Brian and Rafferty go to the extent of proposing that they work as a kind of commodity money in the sense that they substitute for gold as a reference point in a very strange manner, because they represent global capital in a sense as deposits of value, because their ever-changing value, which is referenced permanently, and Tony Norfield makes this point as a counter to Brian and Rafferty, but actually I think it contributes to their argument. Derivatives and the whole system of derivatives, not one derivative in particular, are referenced to the production of commodities and ultimately of surplus value in a global sense. So in that sense, they express the production of social capital, even global capital. So they can work as a reference point of value production and creation. And in that sense, they work as a circulation and as a deposit and as a store of value. And in that sense also, they can express new forms in which the contradiction of money, which is inherent to money in capitalism, with or without derivatives, can find new expressions, which are potentially more explosive. And this, I think, is interesting. This is related also to the role that financial products have played prior to the 2008 crisis, for example, as deposits of value from institutional investors around the world in a search for yield, which, amongst other things, is also a search for stable value. Lisandro has made this point extensively. Also related to all of this is that the expansion of finance and the more aggressive and rapid circulation of financial products is intimately related to the circulation and hedging of productive capital. We cannot draw a neat separation between speculation and actually existing hedging and circulation for the purposes of real capital. That is an artificial distinction. Even though, of course, we can say there are people who speculate and make a profit out of somebody else's loss. This is true, of course. But it is not the underlying cause or the most interesting phenomenon that is happening in financialization. I will wrap it up with my own definition of financialization. I will say it is the acquisition and expansion of moneyness by forms of fictitious capital that circulate in spheres parallel to the commodity exchange and provide new expressions for underlying crises of profitability. And this, I think, captures a lot of what has indeed happened in the last decades with the financial sector, what has been hinted at or expressed by different proponents of financialization literature, what has been expressed in a fetishized form, as it were, as if it were de-linked from problems of profitability. I think they're very much related, and I think it is interesting that we explore deeper how these evolving forms of value, deposit, and expressions of value relate to the circulation of real existing capital. I think that's it. And also, these terms can also work temporarily as a countervailing force to the conventional fall in the rate of profit. I will try to make this point in my master's dissertation, but essentially what it means is what Michael Roberts already said, and it is that the expansion of credit mechanisms delays the expression of prices. Yes, that's it.
Okay, Ricardo, thank you very much for your presentation.
Sure.
And now I suppose I'm going to discuss the three papers, I would say. I must tell from the beginning that I'm not that well prepared for discussing all these things. Perhaps I could say a few things that come to my mind listening to the presentations, and perhaps in this way I will not be fair to all of you, to all the presenters. starting from Stavros's and Turan's presentation, I found it quite comprehensive and helped me to understand better, I would say, the concept of financialization, whatever that means to everybody. And also the other presentations helped me to understand better. And this is a topic that I kept discussing from the very past with Stavros, I recall, and I was telling him that don't spend time. I mean, this is temporary. I mean, it will disappear in the future. Try to find something quite more interesting and because by discussing this topic, you give more value to the people that they support it. But it seems that I was wrong. I think people, more and more people are attracted to that. And although I keep the same opinion that I had in the past, I can explain better, I think, why this happens, or at least my understanding is better. And in cases like that, instead of studying the present, I go back to the past. And I find that the 1920s were not so different from the 1990s or the first decade of this century. During the 1920s, I do that because I do another study about the Greek economy in the interwar crisis, and you cannot talk about an individual economy without discussing the world economy and the US, Germany, England, and so forth. So I discovered that in the US, using new data that I happened to find, that there was a falling rate of profit from the 1920s to 1930 something, and also from a period onwards there was also a falling interest rate. From the 1920s the interest rate is falling, the long run interest rate is falling. So we have a combination of falling rate of profit and falling interest rate. Well, this is the excellent condition to have bubbles. And we happen to have two bubbles in those years. The real estate bubble in Florida, because people were buying houses there not to have to vacation there or to live there, but rather to sell them at a higher price. This is clearly speculation. And also, I don't have to say much about the financial sector and the stock market and what happened. And not only the stock market, but people were engaged in lending activity through purchasing of bonds. There was the Dewey plan in the US, according to which the US was lending to German banks, and this lending was taking place through bonds that people in the US were buying. So there was tremendous speculation activity. Nevertheless, this was not a new state of capitalism, and it was, now I come to Bob's presentation, comes to the present, which is characterized by the exact same two phenomena, that is to say, falling rate of profit and falling interest rate, or very low interest rate. And you just cannot do much about the falling interest rate. The idea of tapering that we hear nowadays is an idea that was tried in the year 1918, okay? 2018, that was on purpose, and that was tapering in that year, 2018, and what happened was the drop in the stock market. The S&P 500 fell, and since the year 2008 till now, there was a 10% growth rate in the stock market. S&P, as I measure it in real prices. And totally it is above 200% higher than the year 2008. Okay? This is not financialization. This is a bubble. And perhaps with the tapering that they will try to apply the next year, or the next year, perhaps we will see something quite interesting. Say interesting, I don't want to say anything more. Now, from the presentations, it came out that we don't know what financialization is. There are different definitions. Listen, if we cannot define something, then we cannot explain it, of course. It's difficulty. And I would like to say that when you have good economic theories, and the theory of productive and unproductive labor is a very good theory established from Adam Smith, continues to Marx, and continues till our days. And this theory includes problems of or issues of non-production activities that expand or reduce. And because these theories happen to be Marxian theories, they are placed aside. And this is a kind of saying that I use, which is that when good economic theories are placed aside, they reappear in distorted forms. And this is what we are experiencing these days. Neoclassical economies, they have the rent-seeking activity, which is accepted and thrives these days. And if we go back in the past, in the 1970s or 1980s, we had the cost disease of the service sector, of the state sector, if you know Baumol's thesis, which nowadays no one talks about it. And all these theories, sooner or later, disappear. Financialization now. I can tell that this is the sector, the finance sector, that suffers the most from the technological change that we experience nowadays. And our study with Paitaridis, who is here, and also another student of mine, Sinis, a paper that we have published in World Review of Political Economy. There we have the unproductive sector, which, to my surprise, at least in the last years, shows that it shrinks. And this, of course, needs some explanation. The explanation that we gave was the falling rate of profit is responsible, and past the point leads to we did some econometric studies, and we saw that the reduction must be attributed to the movement of the rate of profit. So financialization, to make it a new stage of capitalism, is quite an assertion and cannot be supported by facts. I think my thesis or my Bob's view find me in agreement. I mean, more or less, we argued or we said the same thing, which is that falling rate of profit and profitability in general is the variables that we have to pay attention to. Certainly the falling rate of profit, and I could show you graphs about that, leads to stagnating mass of profits, and this is true if we have the production sectors of the economy alone, and we see the profits, and the same phenomenon appears if we have the non-production activities as well. So the total, and I think a graph that Bob showed explained that, and I have another graph that I could have shown, but I don't have it now available to show you, that shows exactly the same thing. That is to say, the finance sector really follows the real sector, and it is shaped by that. Of course, there are interactions, but we have to understand the dialectic here. What is the major and what is the minor? I guess this is what I wanted to say. If something else comes to mind, I will interrupt and say it. So I leave the floor to other people to make comments and discussions. Thank you. Who wants to comment or ask questions?
Can I start? Because since I find these people that work a lot on the profit rate issue, I have a kind of a technical question to ask first of all, because I've been working on the profit rate issue for the last few months. My student actually is writing a postgraduate dissertation on that, so that's the reason. But there is a very technical question first of all. I mean, I have a lot of comments, but if I can find an answer to that at this for today, I think that would be quite great. With this profit rate calculations, okay, profit rate is equal to surplus value divided by constant capital plus variable capital, right? That's the formulation that many people use. And then they make different adjustments, taxes and, historical costs, whatever. Forget about that for a moment. I think that, surplus value is a flow concept. And it's not, I think that's what it is, flow concept. You cannot get a stock concept of that, right? Unless you specify a time period. And constant capital, fixed means of production is a stock concept. Plus variable capital is another flow concept. Like you can calculate yearly, monthly, whatever. First of all, adding constant capital to variable capital, in other words, adding a flow concept to a stock concept is a mistake. You cannot do that simply. It's mathematically incorrect.
Do you take into account the turnover time?
Yeah, I understand that, but I'm keeping with the simplest explanation of the issue, because that turnover time complicates the issue. Because I have an alternative solution. That's why I'm saying. And sometimes people show awareness of that and estimate variable capital, and they calculate profit rate as S over C, right? Sometimes people do that. That's an alternative mechanism. But of course, excluding wages or variable capital is a distortion of Marx's thinking, and it can be quite large, actually. My alternative solution, which I wanted to comment on, is to, rather than using constant capital, use stock of constant capital, use depreciation of capital yearly. I mean, make it a flow concept. If you do that, in fact, actually, you also include the other things like circulating means of production, raw materials and things like that, because C as a stock, you are looking at fixed means of production. But if you calculate C as a flow concept, you may actually include all the raw materials and things like that, and these are really important components of the profit rate too, right? Do you think that's acceptable theoretically proposition? Because then you can actually calculate rate of profit very easily for many numbers of countries, because it's relatively easy. And you can also say statistical links, like for example, whether there is really a link between profit rate and organic composition of capital, etc. I've been doing a lot of work on that, and I got some really interesting results. But my starting point is calculate constant capital as a flow concept.
Well, I'll make a few comments on that. I'm sure everybody else has. Yes, we've got a stock and a flow issue on the denominator of the rate of profit, or the classical view of the rate of profit. solutions provided by other people, as Jeff Terrace said, is, well, we need to take the variable capital and recognise it as a return over time in any one period of production, and that once you work out the turnover, which some people have tended to do, then you can calculate more exactly what the variable capital should be on the denominator once you've used the turnover time. If you look at it on the empirical evidence of the United States or other countries, the size of variable capital relative to constant capital, keeping it just as employee compensation, is much smaller, obviously, than the fixed constant capital or the stock of constant capital. And in fact, over time, it gets smaller. Otherwise, the idea of a rising organic composition of capital would not be correct. And so the variable capital component is getting smaller over time relative to the constant capital component as we define it here. So even though...
Sorry, Michael, can I just interrupt you for a moment? Of course, that's basically the case, because constant capital is really large, and it's a stock, and you are comparing a stock concept with a flow concept. But if you take the flow of capital, that ratio is significant,
All I'm saying, first of all, is that if you exclude variable capital, if you exclude circulating capital in the form of inventories, you'll get a different level of rate of profit, but I find you don't get any difference in the trends that you see in the rate of profit and the turning point, because these factors are decisive. It seems that the stock is, and the relation of that stock to the production of surplus value is decisive in terms of the turn. It makes a difference to the level, and that might be important. So if you want to do it with just using a circulating capital measure for constant capital, a fixed part of constant capital, and include inventories and so on, you will get a different level. Now, the issue here is whether you're going to get a different understanding of the impact of the rate of that on the rate of profit, and therefore a different result altogether from using the other way, which is using a fixed stock of capital relative to the expansion of surplus value, including variable or not. I don't know what the result of that is, but it suggests that the rate of profit depends upon then the development of the depreciation of capital plus inventories. Technically, measuring the depreciation of fixed stock of capital is not easy, because everybody seems to me that official accounts are pretty arbitrary about that. Particularly, I was noticing in the case of Greece. We look at Amicus. Greece's depreciation is ludicrous. I think Jeff Terrace pointed out in the past. So I don't know what that produces in a different result, but theoretically it seems to me that it would be wrong anyway to not count the cost of previous investments in the stock of constant capital and fixed assets, because that surely is still a cost that the capitalists have to bear, and they have paid for it either by borrowing and so on, but it's still part of what they have to recoup in terms of surplus value over lots of production periods. And to just reduce it to the depreciation of fixed stock of capital seems to me not correct, but I'm open to argument. Not sure what this is to do with financialization.
Yeah, I guess doesn't have, but anyway, taking just, I will be very brief, okay, taking just in the denominator the circulating capital, the depreciation in inventories, what you estimate is not the profit rate, the profit margin on cost, which is not the profit rate. Simple cannot become more simple than that. It wouldn't be fair to the session to keep discussing it, and I would like to see if there are other people that they want to ask, and I think
I would like to ask something. Please, I would like to see again the presentation, so the host can upload this presentation, this session, to YouTube, by example, in order to see again the presentation and to think more slowly about each issue. You told about the financialization. So please do it, Stavros or Lefteris. Could you do that for us?
Let me say just a couple of words. I'm recording it through software, but it's being recorded by WAPE as well. And I'll talk with them. In the organization committee, the general understanding is that recordings would be uploaded somehow. I'll see to that, and I'll ask specifically for the recording of this session to be circulated to us, and so to you, Vale, as well. Okay?
Okay. Thank you very much. One question to Michael. Michael, your analysis of profit is quite interesting to me, but I think that it could be useful to contrast your presentation about U.S. with some other countries like Chile, by example. I think that it could be useful to complete your argument, because I think that it could be quite different as some other presentations suggest. That U.S. is a special case, of course. It's the most important case, but it's a special case at the same time. So it's necessary to study in your paper a different country.
Well, yes, actually, I think we have looked at other countries when it comes to rate of profit. I have a pile of Greek Marxist economists here who can tell me exactly when it comes to Greece and other countries. In the case of Chile, where we have a general election, presidential election result coming up tomorrow, I've actually I did a quick study on what's going on in Chile, and there are a number of new papers out on Chile and the rate of profit, which demonstrates by Chilean economists, Marxist economists, that we can look at this question from the point of view of Marxist basis categories for Chile, and they turn out to confirm the law. In fact, we wrote, Nino and I did a publication called World in Crisis 2018 with a range of contributors towards looking at different countries with the rate of profit and where the Marxist law holds. I think, again, we saw a range of different countries where other Marxist economists have come up with similar results in terms of confirming Marxist law. By Marxist law, of course, I mean the tendency of the rate of profit for
yes, the relationship between financial rate of profit and productive rate of profit.
I see. The relationship between the two, whether they are coordinated. Yeah, that's something that we obviously would look at. This Turan's done a lot more work on that than anybody else. We may defer to his evidence so far as to helping us understand that process.
Am I supposed to say something? I don't know. I didn't follow what you...
No, I don't think you are. We can ask for somebody else.
Okay. Anybody?
If I...
I would like to ask something additional. In the case of La Pavitsas, I agree with some of the critiques that I hear listen about La Pavitsas. But I think that La Pavitsas point out a very important issue, that the profit in the financial sector changed in recent years. Now, the financial sector obtains some big share of profit coming from the consumers, because consumers are obtaining something valuable from financial sector. By example, myself spend hours paying my phone, the rent of my telephone the 80s, by example. Now I spend 1 minute thanks to financial sector. It's quite easy. So I pay anything that financial sector asks to me because I are residing a use value. So this change is pointed out by Lapavitsas, and I think that it's a mistake to speak about financial exploitation. But I think that the issue is quite important. It's necessary a Marxist critique of this point in order to understand the financial sector. It's a comment to Stavros, I think so.
Let me pick up this point. The broad argument by Lapavitsas and by others. Dick Bryan and Tal share this view as well. And the post-Keynesians in their own theoretical set, is the following, that you have a separate channel of exploitation in new capitalism, in new financialized capitalism, in financialization, however you define it, and this is through usury. That is usurious lending. You can exploit through usury or expropriate, as Lapavitsas prefer to say afterwards. By how? By incurring a heavier repayment upon the lender, the borrower, than what is the normal. This poses first a serious question: how you define the normal interest rate? Because to define something as usurious, you have first to that is extra normal. You have first to define the normal. You can do it in a Ricardian analysis, where there is a normal interest rate. You can do it probably theoretically, not practically, in neoclassical economics, even in Keynesian economics, but you cannot do it in Marxism, because Marxism does not recognize a physical, a natural, a normal rate of interest. First point this. Second point, there is a redistribution between workers and capitalists through lending. This is a quite old phenomenon. For example, mining communities in England, they were paid at the end of the month. They lived during the month by buying on credit from the company stores, and of course the company stores were more pricey than the normal stores in an urban center. But the workers could not go to an urban center. So a redistribution from labor to capital through such activities existed in the past. It's not something new. Third, the evidence on household, the empirical evidence on household debt is very tricky and very problematic. In the case of Greece, I think it's terrible, the data do not compute. There is a lack of data from one period and backwards, and they have internal inconsistencies. I think the same holds also for more advanced capitalist countries. But taking into account qualitative evidence, we know that household debt, working class household debt, is not something new in capitalism, and probably if we had a consistent and continuous time series, we could see that in previous periods it might be quite high for several countries and at different levels of development. The theoretical issue the theoretical reply to both Lapavitsas and Bryan on this issue, however, is given by Banfine himself, when he said that you disregard, you deform how the value of labor power is defined. And Ben there, in my opinion, was very accurate. Lapavitsas and Bryan on the rest cannot define properly the value of labor power. So there is a secondary level of redistribution from labor to capital. Of course, this existed, and at that point, at several points of time, it can increase and then decrease as well. But this does not constitute a permanent, basic, separate mechanism of exploitation apart from surplus value exploitation. This is my point, and Ben Fine has shown this very aptly in his critique of Lapavitsas on this point. Hope I've answered Vale's question.
Anybody else? Comment? Ask questions.
If nobody else is asking, I can ask another question.
Of course. But you are the presenter, though. Don't forget that.
No, I will ask Michael.
Michael, get cornered again here. Yeah, come on.
Okay, Michael, do you remember, you may remember that I checked with you a data set, a profit rate calculation that my student actually calculated and, using your method. And then I have that method actually here. Can I just say, what I'm trying to say is that when I look at that data to 2019, actually it seems to me that the profit rate is actually increasing before the crisis, right? I mean, look at that. This is your, do you see the exact sheet now? Yeah, this is your profit rate calculation. We use the same method, but we didn't check it with you. If you focus on this part, starting from 1980, profit rate is actually increasing. I know this refers to the whole economy, not the productive sector. And this is from 1995 to 2019, right before the financial crisis, like up until 2006. Actually, profit rate is kind of increasing. Overall, I cannot really square this with the whole profit rate causes financialization as well as crisis. There is another question, if I may ask very quickly. Your presentation, the link between organic composition of capital and profit rate you presented through different time periods, right? And it seems that sometimes these two are negatively correlated. Organic composition of capital goes up and profit rate declines, but there are time periods, and particularly in boom parts, right? They go up together. Isn't this an inconsistency? Why do both of them go up, right? And also, one last point. These two, you are establishing a link, but not causality, you see. These two could be caused by different reasons. During crisis, for example, organic composition of capital can increase for different reasons, and profit could fall down for different reasons too.
Okay, well, I think there are 4 points there of a completely different presentation, Lefteris, which is a critique of Michael Roberts' approach to profit rate, which certainly we should discuss. All I can say very briefly, as it's not quite relevant to our presentation discussion today, is that the profit rate that Turan has presented in front of you on the screen, which is the overall profit rate of the whole economy, includes all that fictitious profit, which is particularly significant that Peter Jones showed in the period from about the beginning of the 21st century up until 2007. If you strip that out, Peter Jones shows that we don't have a rising rate of profit prior to 2007. In the case of the non-financial sector, we don't have a rising rate of profit prior to 2007. And so the argument would be that this particular measure of the profit rate, which is really more useful, it helps the comparison with other countries because we don't have the data we have with that we get with the US and the UK, is not a very good measure of what's going on with the productive sector and the rate of profit. That's the first point I would make on this. So I'm prepared to concede that the Roberts profit rate, which he starts off with, which isn't the only one I use, but it's one that I've used in previous occasions, is not very useful, particularly with the period leading up to the Great Recession of 2008-9. But overall, if you want to take the whole period of 45 up until now, it still has a powerful, compelling explanation of Marx's law, in my view. On the question of correlations and causation, it's a big issue, but there's been a lot of Greenwich causation studies done, both by myself and particularly by Jose Tapia, to show that profits lead investment and not the other way around. Leading up to crises, there's a lot of evidence on that, and in the relationship between organic composition and the profit rate. Well, the Marx's law says that if the rate of surplus value is rising faster than the rate of the organic composition of capital, then you will get a rise in the rate of profit, other things being equal, and the evidence would show that on the graphs that I did show. But Turan's pointing out there are times when there's actually a fall in the organic composition of capital, or that there's a rise in the rate of the organic composition of capital and not a fall in the rate of profit. I would argue it's a question of the two factors involved, the organic composition of capital and the rate of surplus value and the relation between. And if you look at the correlations, which I haven't shown there, correlations are very high, negatively between the organic composition of capital and the rate of profit, and very positive between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit, as you would expect. Correlation is not causation, but I would argue that other evidence shows that causation direction is clear between profit and investment, which is the key factor that you have to relate it to. Otherwise, profit rate measures are not relevant if they don't show what it has an impact. As Ricardo was pointing out, as Andrew Kleiman and Williams have pointed out, that there is a strong correlation between profitability and investment, and that hasn't really been broken by so-called financialization.
To that secondary point, which is that it's Turan's question possibly points to also a problem that we should be aware of when using national statistics of a single country, for example, which is that it abstracts from world trade, and particularly the issue of extraordinary surplus value or the effect of increasing productivity of capital displayed on markets, because for a period of time within a particular country, the capitals in that country are increasing their productivity. This can mean that they are appropriating a greater share of surplus value in the world economy, and therefore you will display an increasing rate of profit along with an increase in the organic composition of capital. A similar thing will happen during periods of increasing productivity from vanguard capitalists, and Galima on after this explained very clearly. It's called extraordinary surplus value. So this can be an expression of that. One would have to see what is happening in this particular country and period to see if this is a valid explanation of this observation. But it's not inconsistent with the labor theory of value.
Anybody wants to comment? And please tell me, what time do we finish?
Yeah, but with these telesessions, we have a liberty. We have some degrees of liberty.
Okay. It's fine with me. It's fine with me.
If nobody wants to raise an issue, may I say a few words it seems that in this panel that Lefteri's initial view, that is, don't pay attention to financialization, it is not something significant, has predominated, although I was sure that I have convinced him to the contrary, probably because we are almost all on the same page, saying that real accumulation is the determining sphere, and the financial sector and the sphere of circulation follows suit, and not vice versa, as actually financialization, at least the majority financialization, to be just, argue. Nevertheless, the picture of this panel is not probably, unluckily, representative of the general opinion. The financialization literature is expanding. This is, in my opinion, a problem for not only Marxist analysis, but from generally heterodox analysis in economics, because once again, as with globalization, neoliberalism and things like this, there is an infatuation with something passing, a fleeting probably phenomenon, which is inaugurated as a structural phenomenon. This creates analytical and empirical problems and creates significant also political problems, if you want to take them into consideration. And for this reason, we need to discuss financialization and probably debunk it. That is, so it's analytical and empirical errors and inconsistencies, and we have to do this even if we consider it from a more abstract point of view as simply a loss of time. It's probably a loss of time, but it is around us. Or to put it better, we are within it, rather vice versa. Just a few points on this. First, that the predominant view of financialization nowadays is simply a buzzword, the increase of financial activities. This says nothing actually. There is a more dangerous path, and this is the path that says that finance, however defined as independent means of revenue from surplus value extraction, this means a new capitalism or a different capitalism, or even a completely different post-capitalist or whatever system. This is totally wrong in my opinion, and leads scientific analysis to wrong paths. And I finish this, I would want to say something about Brian's point that Ricardo brought again forward, that is derivatives as a form of money. I don't agree with this. I don't think that this stands, but this is a long discussion. There are replies to this to Brian, that is derivatives cannot have all the forms, all the functions of money, and for this reason are not money. Anyway, I'll stop here.
I'll just add to Stavros and Mark. By the way, I think derivatives are a bit like viruses, aren't they? They have to connect to something else, otherwise they don't survive. The other point about financialization and why it's important is not only is it about dominance. I mean, if you go to IPI conferences or any sort of conference where there's lots of discussion on the left in economics, financialization, with the word financialization, dominant. I mean, the last IPI conference must have had about 50 papers with the word financialization. Africa, in India, in all over the place, in all different forms of agriculture, financialization. So something is going on here, which the left, economists and academics think are important. So we have to look at this and see whether there's a point here, whether we can define financialization properly, once we've defined it, we can decide whether it means something which changes the way that we should analyse capitalist economies in 2020. This panel has attempted to suggest that it's either an amorphous term, which means nothing much at all, or attempts to change the whole definition of capitalism and the laws of motion of capitalism in a way which differs from what we as Marxists thought was the case previously. And if they're correct, then that means a completely different way of looking at the capitalist economy and what is important to look at the capitalist economy. Not profitability anymore, but the size of the financial sector, the debt, the instability of the debt, the Minsky argument, if you like. That seems to me what this is, this panel, this argument is about. There's one other thing, which I'll finish with, is the policy implication. Because the financialization experiments are basically telling us that finance is causing crises in capital. But we must deal with finance. It doesn't matter about capitalism as a whole. And the regulation and control of finance is what matters. You look at Krippner and the others, basically end up saying we need to regulate finance. Go to any IPI conference, we need to regulate finance. Go to any policy meeting of the labour movement in the left, we need to regulate finance. Well, regulation, of course, is nonsense. It doesn't work. I spent a lot of time explaining how regulation totally fails to control the excesses and speculations of finance. Regulation is what leads from financialization, not the replacement of profit-motive financial capitalists with control by the people over the ownership and control of the financial sector. So regulation of finance is the opposite policy as opposed to the replacement of capitalism altogether. So there is a fundamental point which leads basically to the same old argument. What we need to do is reform capitalism and have a revolution to get rid of capitalism. But that's behind, it seems to me, the ideological result of financialization, and possibly in many cases, although none of the academics who push it forward might not think that so, is often the motivation behind which they're suggesting. They want to end the argument of the law of value, that capitalism is an exploitive system by a small group of people who own the means of production, and we need to remove that control of the means of production and socialise it. They don't want to argue that anymore. They want to argue about this particular sector being an issue.
I think Ricardo wanted to
I just like to make a quick remark on Stavros' comment. I read the debate between Tony Norfield and Brian and Rafferty. I found it quite interesting, and I think Tony Norfield's response to some of the sillier statements made by Brian and Rafferty, but the more interesting statements and the stronger statements, he doesn't actually respond to them. He misrepresents what they're saying. And Tony Norfield makes a point with that derivatives have no intrinsic value, which is obviously true, and he makes a point that the value of derivatives as a risk position derives from the value of real existing commodities and variables like exchange rates or interest rates at one particular point in time, which is of course true, but I think it's missing the point. The point that Brian and Rafferty are making is that, for example, credit also has no intrinsic value. It's an institutional arrangement, a commitment. So in that sense, derivatives play a similar role in the sense that they are a risk position that is based on an institutional agreement, a lawful agreement, whereby value is posited and circulated and accepted as a measure of value, which is independent, of course, from the notional value of the commodity on which the derivative is based. It has nothing to do with it. It is a risk position calculated by models which are imaginary, which have no real basis, but which are accepted institutionally, and which serve to commodify the production of these risk positions, and thereby enable the circulation of value. And this imaginary circulation of value is used by institutions to circulate real existing value. And this is the interesting part of the argument. And I don't think Tony Norfield really responds to that at all in the discussion.
Okay, I may say a few words, but I will cover the whole time.
Doesn't matter.
Okay. Let me say this first. Behind Dick Bryan's view, Rafferty's and so on, there is a credit theory of money. I don't agree with this. That is, money is simply the power of the state. I don't agree with this. There is always, I think that the general idea of the Marx theory, monetary theory, that the means of circulation ought to have even an indirect relation to the sphere of production is correct, and we can explore these means. The other way around, that is, the means of circulation, the currency is simply a directive by the state does not hold, or else it would always hold, and we know that currencies depreciate, lose the purchasing power, and lose their credibility, and for this reason states change currencies quite often in several cases. So I don't agree with the credit theory of money, that it is behind Bryant and Rafferty's first. Second, if we continue to keep in mind the link with the sphere of production, then derivatives do not have such a link. They are indeed a bet, a virus, a parasite existing on something else. They are not universally accepted. And to draw a parallel with bitcoins and things like this, cryptocurrencies, where there is a parallel similar discussion whether they constitute actual currencies or not. My opinion is not that they do not constitute. There is another dangerous thing if we accept the Bryan line of thinking, that is that this money, and somehow it comes with that it can also create profits if not value. If you go into that link, then the argument by Christophers, for example, that risk taking is a value creating activity is valid, and it's the only way to say how such a means can produce more value than what it represents, for example. Now, risk-taking as a source of profit is the only basic, the main basic neoclassical explanation behind profits. And even the fathers, some fathers of neoclassicism, for example Valera, rejected it for obvious and logical reasons.
Yeah. What's interesting, I think, is that Bryan and Rafferty do not actually endorse a credit theory of money. They do not say that derivatives derive value from the fact that they have institutional acceptance, or that credit is money because it has institutional acceptance. What they say actually is that all money systems, including credit systems and derivative systems, have some basis in commodity value, in real existing value in commodities. And what they argue is that gold can no longer play this function. In fact, the role that gold has played, if ever, has always been problematic, because the rate at which gold exchanges is not the price of production, but allegedly a pure price. And there has been discussions about this. It's not necessarily relevant. But the point they try to make is that the reason why the derivative system as such is important is because it has links to commodity. As you said, it is parasitical. So the derivative system is parasitical on real existing commodities and the expectation of real existing surplus value. As such, they have a link to commodity production, and they propose that this link is somehow a measure of value that sustains the Marxist argument that money has to have a direct link to abstract social labor embodied in a physical commodity. So they say, what else is playing this role today, if not gold? Well, look at what is happening with derivatives. Perhaps derivatives are taking that place. So they're not actually endorsing institutional theory of money, they're actually opposing it.
Well, that's an interesting version of Brian's view. Not one I thought we have been corrected by Ricardo, so I'm going to have to read this to make sure that that interpretation is correct, because Stavros doesn't agree. So, but anyway, if Ricardo's right, then Brian is on our side after all.
No.
I think he's, although he doesn't accept financialization, he has a fetishized view of the crisis. And on that point, which is important, he is on the post-Keynesian side. But what I sustain is this is not a logical consequence.
Financial crises are the cause of crises, or financial instability is the cause of crisis. It's just that financial stability is also connected to commodity value, apparently as well. So I'm not quite sure which way they're going. But
I think that's an inconsistency in the work.
Let me say just one word, because I have spoken a lot. I think the Brian Rafferty's and so on work has an evolution. You can find many contradictory arguments there and positions, but essentially, since they discard any notion, even a distant and indirect, of some link of the currency to the real accumulation, not necessarily the gold rule, of course, but some link to that. The other way is only the credit theory of money, if you want to be consistent. Now, Brian Rafferty are not an exemplary case of consistency. They use the term value, but in a sense that its labor content in the end is almost totally extinguished. So there are inconsistencies. I think that in the end, in the back of their mind, they have a credit theory of money, somehow institutionally determined. The state, what is accepted implicitly or implicitly or explicitly, and this leads to another problem, that this means of payment, this currency, what value does it have, or what value does it represent? And moreover, if it is able on its own to create new value, and there enters a risk, which is terribly problematic. And they said this, actually. Christopher is not very far. It's very close from to Brian's logic. Christopher simply just say it directly. That's it.
Left Terrace, I've got to go. Can I go?
Just I will make my last point, and then we can go all of us. And that is the following. I'm not familiar with this border literature that you mentioned, derivatives, with the derivatives and all these new forms of money, but I'm wondering, if gold doesn't play any role, why do central banks hold gold in their vaults and they don't sell it? Super simple question that demands an answer, and I don't find any answer yet. Whenever banks and the Central Bank of Greece, sometime in the year 1998, I think, 99, that gold was pretty high, I think, they start selling gold, and they interrupted it all of a sudden. And now, And now from what I see, Smith's administration, from what I see, the gold in the Central Bank of Greece, the volume of gold has increased. And I think most of central banks in the world, despite of all the discussion about derivatives and all these kinds of things, Bitcoin, etc., but they grow. Nevertheless, I don't see central banks to reduce their gold reserves. They increase them. How do you explain this?
It's a hedge against fiat currencies, isn't it?
Excuse me?
It's a hedge against fiat currencies. I mean,
it might be something.
Not that they believe in gold. Not that they believe more in gold.
Let me say this:
kind
it's more than a hedging, because you can hedge in other things like other currencies, but it is a precaution in the case of a collapse of the currency system. If your currency system collapse, the only way to rebuild it is if you have something that has a monetary representation and that at the same time it is linked to the sphere of production. And gold is traditionally this means. So it's a precaution against the collapse of the currency system.
As Keynes would say, be going back to barbarism.
What the Soviets did for a small period when there was a danger of collapse of the new Soviet currency, the two currencies they used for a period in the early Soviet Union. The one was denominated in gold.
Ricardo, you want to have the last word?
I was just wondering if the
Well,
volume.
then I will leave. After that, I will leave.
Okay. No, it's fine. I was just wondering what the volume of gold and what the volume is, and if it's comparable at all to GDP or to exchange figures, and to see what the role is.
The other way around, I would say, the GDP is comparable to gold.
Right, is it?
Anyway, I mean, this is a long discussion.
Well, gold compared to fiat currencies is tiny if you're measuring them in $1 terms. So we have lots of fictitious money out there.
Okay.
And food for organizing another panel at another time.
Why we don't you the organizers? Why don't you ask financialization people to participate in a debate? That would be fair. I mean, you have to locate them and ask them to participate.
All over Italy, we can find them easy.
Okay.
Well, very good. That was a very good session. I thank you for your contributions and hope to see you sometime very soon. My regards and goodbye.
Bye, everybody.